I am Christopher Ocker. I am a dean here at the Graduate Theological Union, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you. Many of us here at the GTU are interested in the material conditions of religious thought, practice, and experience. That gives us a sense of strong affinity with our friends at the Berkeley Center for the Study of Religion and the Berkeley Center for the Science of Psychedelics at the University of California. That sense of affinity, I hope, I'm not presumptuous to say, I think is reciprocated and expressed in the co-sponsorship of this event by both BCSR, the Berkeley Center for the Study of Religion, and the Berkeley Center for the Study of Psychedelics. It's expressed in the BCSR Graduate Student Working Group, Psychedelics, Science, and Religion, coordinated by two of our PhD students, Feliciana Carter and Pablo Vasquez. I think it's also expressed by BCSR's contribution to the cost of filming this event tonight. We at the GTU are hoping to contribute to the study of psychedelics in Berkeley. To that end, we are inaugurating a new MA concentration in psychedelics and spirituality this fall. And we hope that we will enjoy deeper collaborations with BCSP and BCSR in the future. Moderating tonight's panel is Dr. Sam Shonkoff, the Tobey Family Associate Professor of Jewish Studies here at the GTU. Sam is a graduate of the University of Chicago, a student of several of the most prominent scholars of Judaism in our generation: Mendes Flores, Fishbane, Magid, Novak. He's a specialist in the thought of Martin Buber, Hasidism, and Jewish mysticism. I count it a great privilege to call Sam a colleague, and Sam will introduce our panelists. And Sam, I now turn it over to you.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you to all of our panelists. I want to turn it over as soon as possible to this really extraordinary group of human beings to my left here. But I also recognize that there were no prerequisites or required reading to attend, and I want to just situate us a bit in terms of this realm of psychedelics and religion, psychedelics and spirituality, which might be deeply familiar to some in this room and might be totally uncharted territory to others. So of course, this entanglement between psychedelics and spirituality presumably goes back as long as Homo sapiens have been intentionally or unintentionally ingesting psychoactive plants and fungi. What we're looking at specifically today, especially today, is entanglements between psychedelics and religion in this modern weird field over the past century, let's say, in psychedelic studies, in psychedelic research. And this has been very explicitly and directly like an ongoing theme in this field. Most famously in the 1962 study, sometimes called the Good Friday experiment or the Marsh Chapel experiment, which was a doctoral dissertation project by Walter Pahnke at the Harvard Divinity School under the supervision of Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert, perhaps better known as Ram Dass, where he had a group of almost entirely Protestant seminary students from the Boston area. And half of them were ingested psilocybin, half a placebo. All of them were having this experience underneath Howard Thurman's Marsh Chapel at Boston University on Good Friday, hearing the sermon. And what Pahnke, as a divinity doctoral student, seemed to discover, not discover, but see was something that was probably incredibly obvious to many people already, is that psilocybin, better known as magic mushrooms, has this apparently remarkable capacity to catalyze what Pahnke was describing as a mystical experience, drawing especially on early 20th century concepts of mystical experience. In the study that in many ways inaugurated the so-called renaissance of psychedelic research in the 21st century, this landmark 2006 study out of Johns Hopkins University was in many ways trying to replicate and improve upon the insights, the revelations from this Good Friday experiment. Even using as one of their metrics was the so-called Richards-Pankey Mystical Experience Questionnaire, referring to Pankey, the Harvard divinity student, and Bill Richards, one of the researchers on this Hopkins team. Apparently they tried to find especially theologians and religious leaders for this study, but had trouble with recruitment. But again, they showed, as the title of this 2006 article suggests, that psilocybin has a capacity, quote, to occasion mystical type experiences having substantial and sustained personal meaning and spiritual significance. Now, 20 years later, what's really bringing us together today, first and foremost, just a couple weeks ago, a really groundbreaking, but also sort of retrospective study has just been published, whose title is Effects of Psilocybin on Religious and Spiritual Attitudes and Behaviors in Clergy from Various Major World Religions. This project, which brought together a team of researchers from Hopkins and NYU, was explicitly trying to build upon and improve upon the Good Friday experiment, and to continue to explore these insights that have been verified and validated in a number of studies around the capacity of psychedelics, specifically psilocybin, to occasion mystical experiences. Recruitment for this began in 2014. The sessions themselves were in 2017. And a core question of this study, I'm just quoting it from this scientific article that was just published. Given the association between psilocybin use and spirituality or religion, how would psychedelic naive professional religious leaders, meaning religious leaders who have never had experiences with psychedelics before, experience and interpret the effects of psilocybin? What, if any, enduring effects might be observed, and what, if any, impact would it have on their professional work as clergy? So I just want to briefly lay out the general structure of the study, some of the interesting results, and just a bit about the reception of this study before I turn it over here. So the subjects in the study, the participants, were psychedelic naive clergy from various major world religions, as the study phrases it. These ended up being 24 participants who participated in the whole program. They were about 3/4 of them were Christian clergy from different, mostly Protestant denominations, a Muslim religious leader, a Zen Buddhist leader, several rabbis, and the scientists point out that these demographics roughly reflect the demographics of religious populations in the United States. What we should add is that Jews are drastically overrepresented in this study. Jews are about 2% of the US population and about 17% of the study participants. And a fun fact is that there was a sort of overabundance of rabbis who applied for the study, but it ended up being strikingly difficult to find any who had never tried psychedelics before. Now, there were 2 sessions that the 24 leaders themselves underwent with a moderately high psilocybin dose. And there was extensive preparation beforehand. So before their first psilocybin experience, they had 4 meetings with 2 session facilitators, so a total of 8 hours of preparation work. During the experience, which lasted for about 8 hours, there were 2 session facilitators, for all intents and purposes, at all times in this day-long session. And then integration sessions afterwards with the facilitators, where they would meet to sort of process and unpack these experiences for 3 hours total after each of the sessions. And the results that came up of this, I'm not going to go through all of them, but just highlighting some striking ones. According to the metrics for mystical experience, which we'll subject to all kinds of criticism, I'm sure, shortly, 88% of participants had a complete mystical experience in at least one of their sessions, according to these metrics. And then I want to just read straight from the scientific article for some of the other result details. And before reading, I want us to bear in mind that the average age of these religious leaders was 48 years old. And the average time that they had been engaged in their religious or spiritual vocational activities was about 20 years. I'm quoting from the article here. Similar to ratings at the end of session days, at 16 months, 1.25 years later, participants rated the psilocybin session experiences to be among the top 5 most spiritually significant of their lives at 96%. 79% of them said among the top 5 personally meaningful of their lives, 83% of the most psychologically insightful, and 42% top 5 psychologically challenging experiences of their lifetime. And I'll note that 13% of the participants rated at least one of their experiences as the most psychologically challenging experience of their life. 92% of participants rated their experience to be among the 5 most profound sacred experiences of their lifetime, with 42% rating as the single most profound. 54% of these religious leaders said that their psilocybin experiences deepened their appreciation or understanding of their own religious tradition. Most also endorsed as strong or extreme that their sacred experience enriched their contemplative prayer or meditation practices. 79% said that. And increased their sense of the sacred in daily life. Again, 79%. When asked about the most salient experience of unconditional love during psilocybin sessions, 79% rated that experience as among the top 5 such experiences of their lifetime, end quote. I want to note that not everyone had such rosy experiences. 5 of the 29 participants declined the second session, some because the first felt disturbing for a variety of reasons. And the article notes that about 4% of participants endorsed moderate or strong negative changes in behaviors or attitudes associated with their spiritual or religious vocation. And 4% said that the experience eroded their appreciation or understanding of their own religious tradition. Notable, and yet the scientists conclude 4% is quite low. And so in their conclusion, in this population of clergy, and I'm quoting here, psilocybin led to, among other things, positive changes in religious attitudes and behavior, as well as their vocation as a religious leader. So just a note before we turn to the panel about the reception of this study, and we're going to get in much more into this, I'm sure, in our discussion. I'd say major aspects of the reception. One has been a sort of wonder and intrigue and awe around some of these findings, and going into great enthusiasm around, is this some sort of key to a new renewal or transformation of religions and spirituality? There's also been a significant amount of controversy around this study. People pointing out various flaws in the study design, most of which at least are named in the article itself, some of which I'm sure we'll discuss tonight. Scholars of religion, like myself, raising basic questions about some of the basic terms in the study, like mystical experience, and just noting that the first 7 footnotes of the article itself are pointing to scholarly works on religion and mysticism published between 1902 and 1975. A few of them from before 1945. And I just wonder, in what world in a scientific article is it appropriate to ignore recent decades of scholarly work in a field that is taken seriously in its sophistication. And most dramatically, one Presbyterian pastor who was not connected officially with the study, but who had been a quite outspoken sort of psychedelic enthusiast, had a change of heart and identified himself as a whistleblower and argued, among other things, that this Hopkins NYU team of researchers was, quote, part of a strategy to integrate psychedelics into mainstream religion. He reached out to the IRB board, who oversees sort of the methodological integrity and ethics of research. And there was an investigation that lasted for over a year that did conclude that there were matters of serious non-compliance regarding unapproved study team members, one study team member whose role as a sponsor of the subject was not disclosed to the IRB, conflicts of interest related to those two researchers, and failure to report funding sponsorship to the IRB. So I just want to emphasize that we're not here tonight to defend this study. We're not here tonight to debunk this study. We're here tonight to really think deeply and critically with it, to think about what this study and what this moment more broadly does for helping us think about entanglements between religion, spirituality, and psychedelics. And to do so, we have this incredible panel who I will introduce now. I'll then invite each of them to share opening reflections, and then we'll have robust time for discussion, and at the end, some Q&A. So I'll begin with the least known person on this panel, which is Michael Pollan here. He is a writer, teacher, and activist. He has covered psychedelic studies really for a full decade now, bookended by two New Yorker articles, one in 2015 on the trip treatment, one that came out just on May 19th of this year on this very study we're discussing, and of course his wildly influential book, How to Change Your Mind, that came out in 2018. So many books on the bestseller list, books on the best book of the year of the New York Times. Michael Pollan teaches in the English department at Harvard, and for many years served as the Knight Professor of Journalism at UC Berkeley's Graduate School of Journalism, and is a founding member of the UC Berkeley Center for the Science of Psychedelics. Zac Kamenetz is a rabbi and community leader based in Berkeley. He was a participant in the study that we're discussing today. Zac is the founder and CEO of Shefa, an independent nonprofit organization founded in 2020, and is dedicated to supporting Jewish psychedelic explorers in North America and abroad. Shefa, a word that means flowing abundance in Hebrew, is helping to cultivate greater awareness in the Jewish community about the potential rewards and risks of psychedelic use in a variety of settings, advocating for a more culturally competent and religiously inclusive approach to Jewish experience in the psychedelic world. He's also trained in a variety of modalities in psychedelic-assisted therapy. Aidan Seale-Feldman is an assistant professor of anthropology at Notre Dame. She's a medical and psychological anthropologist. And her forthcoming book from University of Chicago Press, which I think will be out soon, is entitled The Work of Disaster, Crisis and Care Among a Himalayan Fault Line. It's an ethnography of mental health governance in Nepal in the aftermath of disaster. And her current research focuses on the mainstreaming of mysticism in the United States, with special attention to psychedelics. Her current project is funded by the Templeton Foundation. It's entitled Ethical Substance, Psychedelic Medicine in Times of Social and Spiritual Crisis. And Aidan is really going to help us, among other things, think about the place of secularism in this landscape we're exploring. Bia Labate is an anthropologist, a social anthropologist, and wears an incredible number of hats in this community and throughout the world. She has authored, co-authored, and co-edited 28 books, 3 special edition journals, and many peer-reviewed and online publications. Her work focuses on plant medicines, drug policy, shamanism, ritual, religion, and social justice. She's the executive director of the Chacruna Institute for Psychedelic Plant Medicines and serves as a public education and culture specialist at the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, known as MAPS. And finally, last but not least, Michael Silver is professor of optometry and vision science and neuroscience at University of California, Berkeley, and is the founding director of the UC Berkeley Center for the Science of Psychedelics. Last year, Michael's group launched the first ever studies involving the administration of psychedelics to human research subjects at UC Berkeley. And more broadly, his research investigates how the human brain constructs representations of the visual environment and how these representations are modified by cognitive processes such as attention, expectation, and learning. All right. Yes, let's do it. So I'm turning it over first to Michael Pollan for some opening reflections.
Thank you, Sam. Great pleasure to be here talking about this study. I thought I was done writing about psychedelics till I heard about this study, and it just seemed like such a weird idea. It was also part of a tradition of psychedelic research that I had followed in my book, as Sam suggested, going back to the Marsh Chapel experiment in 1962. I mean, I sort of see psychedelic research as falling into 3 buckets right now. There is the therapeutic work, very important, a lot of it happening at UCSF and Hopkins and NYU, using psychedelics to treat various forms of mental illness. And then there's the basic science bucket, which is what we're doing at Berkeley and Michael's working on. And then there is this other bucket that is around issues of belief and metaphysics and mystical experience. And this falls in that tradition. I was just kind of curious because I think the hope on the part of the researchers was to answer a question that hadn't been resolved by the 2006 study that Sam mentioned, which found that that researchers using a fairly high dose of psilocybin could reliably occasion mystical experiences, and that's defined by this questionnaire that is always under revision. We can talk more about that later. But if you notice in the title, they often refer to as mystical type experience, because there was this question whether it was authentic or just a drug-induced state. And the hope on the part of the researchers here, at least as they expressed it to me, was to get some clarity on that question from people who were unusually well qualified, had read the literature on mystical experience, which is, undergirds many religions, and presumably had them themselves, although that wasn't always the case, and could offer a kind of more nuanced understanding of this phenomenon, which humans appear to be wired for. And it's a literally extraordinary state. And psychedelics obviously are not the only way to achieve it. So I set out to interview as many of the participants as I could. I probably interviewed about 15 of them at great length. These were some really good talkers, as you could imagine, and multiple interviews, very eloquent people. I had never interviewed clergy before. It was fascinating. I mean, these are people paid to think about big questions, but what I was able to do that I don't think you see reflected in the paper is dive deep into the experience of these people, the qualitative dimension of it. The paper is about quantitative. You heard all the statistics, and they're interesting, but they're a very narrow aperture through which to understand what happened. And there was a lot of work done to interview, not just me, but have researchers interview the participants. And there was a qualitative paper that was planned, but will apparently never come out. And we can talk about the reasons for that now. I was fortunate in that I was allowed to read a draft of it and draw from it and quote from it in my piece. But because of the controversies surrounding this study, the Hopkins IRB doesn't want this data, which is to say these wonderful interviews, ever to get out. And I think that's really a shame. So the findings that I observed, and these are not, again, quantitatively rigorous. I just want to run through a couple of them because I think they're really interesting and not necessarily captured in the study that's been published. As you heard, an overwhelming majority had mystical experiences, many for the first time, and had no doubt as to their authenticity. They thought this was no different than what they'd read about in the literature. Almost all of them, the overwhelming majority, had divine encounters. God was not embodied necessarily, actually wasn't at all, was felt as a presence, somebody right behind you or right next to you or suffusing you. And in most of the cases, now this is of the people I interviewed, not of the full group, God was a feminine presence. This blew a lot, and there were men who reported this as well. Some people are not surprised. And this really blew a lot of people's minds. One person talked about it, it blew up patriarchal religion for me. A Baptist theologian said that God was a lot like a Jewish mother, and she was quite surprised by that. The only one that I talked to who didn't have a divine encounter was, wait for it, the Buddhist, who traveled to a realm beyond concept for which she had no words. It's kind of perfect. The study, even though it wasn't a therapeutic study, it turned out to be therapeutic for several of the clergy. It's a very high burnout profession, I learned. And I talked to many people who really were recommitted, shelved their plans for retirement, approached the liturgy with new enthusiasm, felt that they had gotten much more effective as communicators, as sermon givers. And so and they were very pleased about that. Many of them reported increased openness to the imagery and practice of other religions, and feeling that all these religions are different paths to the same goal. That's something I heard repeatedly. Zac can talk to this later, but several had a kind of conversion experience, not to another religion, but to psychedelics. And several people, 3, actually devoted themselves in the wake of sometimes years later, in the wake of the study, to creating groups to help facilitate the use of psychedelics in their faith. And Zac is one of those 3, and he can tell us more about that. This, I think, is part of the controversy. This is very troubling to some people. Such as the supposed but not real whistleblower that you heard alluded to. And there was a belief among many people, and I'll stop at this point, that after their experience, that psychedelics had the potential to revivify religious traditions that they felt had become kind of ossified or stultified over time. And that what was missing from religion was the power of direct experience. Which in the course of many religions, of course, over history, gives way to tradition and belief and ritual. And that there has always been, and this too was very controversial, I think, for many observers, there's always a tension in religion between orthodoxies and people having direct experience. And how do you reconcile those two things? And hopefully we'll talk more about it. This is a very controversial idea. It runs deep in the history of religion. You think of antinomianism, you think of the Reformation, and that the idea that psychedelics could be causing that sort of pressure within organized religion is both troubling to some and very exciting to others. So I think I'll leave it right there.
Okay. Good evening. Thank you all for being here. Thanks to the Dean, thanks to Sam, the GTU, for having us for this conversation. In the summer of 1963, on his day off from working as a counselor at Camp Ramah in East Hampton, Connecticut, Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi, once a missionary for the Hasidic movement of Chabad Lubavitch, met the recently discredited Professor Timothy Leary at a Vedanta ashram in Cohasset, Massachusetts, for his first LSD trip. Reb Zalman's reflections on that 12-hour journey became the first recorded Jewish psychedelic report, the Baal Shem Tov's Aliyas HaNeshama, the soul ascension of the great founder of the Hasidic movement, and the LSD experience. Hopefully, our moderator, Professor Shankoff, will say more about that later tonight. In that report, Reb Zalman affirms that while LSD could expand consciousness, it didn't carry the sanctity he felt in the weekly experience of Shabbos, the Sabbath. As he put it, I found some things in Shabbos that weren't in LSD. I didn't go anywhere. The sense of going to a destination, raising my question with a heavenly mentor, and coming back with a specific answer from there, that is one reason. Another reason was that it wasn't Jewish enough for me. A universe in which everything was happening wasn't Jewish enough. And so, in 1963, he issued what may have been the very first call for culturally and spiritually grounded psychedelic care for the Jewish community. He wrote, "It is bound to be taken by more and more people." We can just look around Berkeley. "We need to train Jewish spiritual directors in the LSD experience, put our texts to use. What I would want to do if I had the opportunity again is to control it in the Stiebel setting, the traditional small group spiritual community, with more Jewish paraphernalia, music, pictures, space arrangement. But I'd also want someone who's the ground control, to keep calling attention to a Jewish program." Even as a mystical universalist, Zalman understood that tripping in a Hindu ashram with Leary, gazing at statues of Buddha, Jesus, and Krishna, could feed his intellect, but not his Jewish spirit. Around the same time, a young rabbi in training named Arthur Green was exploring similar territory. He told me that after 10 LSD experiences, he wrote in an article that he assumed a pseudonym for, that the Kabbalists of old were, quote, experts at climbing the mountain, slowly and deliberately. But today, as he said, we are driving up the mountain in a fast car, equipped with brightly flashing multicolored headlights. We'll get there faster and more easily, if we get there at all. Together, Zalman and Green helped ignite something that's quietly smoldered for decades, a Jewish psychedelic underground. A sprawling, intergenerational, disorganized network of rabbinical students and professors, deadheads and youth group advisors, clinical psychologists and political radicals, socialist kibbutznikim and messianic settlers, Hasidic wives microdosing in secret, Jewish burners, fish fans doing 3 nights at the garden, and philanthropists funding ketamine clinics by day and studying Zohar by night. Some seek healing, some chase transcendence, some are trying to stitch together a Judaism that they can believe in again. Some are just following the music. This underground hasn't always had a language. It hasn't always had safety, but it has roots and hunger, and now it has momentum. In 2016, I was accepted into the Hopkins NYU study, partly because, as Michael says, I was psychedelically naive. But after my 2 sessions in Baltimore, I began speaking about the experience in my Jewish community, and I quickly realized I wasn't just psychedelically naive, I was Jewish psychedelically naive. I had no idea how many Jews across denominations, geographies, generations have been quietly working with these medicines, these compounds, these plants, these fungi. I started hearing stories from rabbis, therapists, musicians, activists, people who had been navigating expanded states of consciousness not as tourists, but as seekers, builders, and healers. I realized I'd been dropped into a lineage I hadn't known existed. So I began to realize what wasn't needed was more access. What was needed was a vessel, a container for all the blessing and all the wrestling that already existed but didn't have many places to land. That's how I started Shefa, the organization I lead. That's how it was born. We create spiritually grounded, Jewishly rooted spaces for psychedelic healing and integration through retreats, holiday-based learning, and one-on-one support. And increasingly, we're not just serving individuals, but communities, rabbis, educators, therapists, parents, people in grief, people in transition, all asking how to bring these experiences into covenant, into practice, into relationship with the divine of their own understanding. But we didn't want to work from anecdotes alone. We needed to know more. So in partnership with researchers at Emory University, we launched the Psychedelic Jewish Journey Study, the first ever research effort to understand what Jews are actually doing with psychedelics, what they're seeking, what their concerns are, and what kind of support they say they need. And what we're finding across ages, affiliations, and experiences is striking. Just 3 points. People are hungry for ritual frameworks, spiritual mentorship, and theological tools. They're often practicing in isolation, not because they want to, but because they don't see a Jewish path they trust and don't know how to find the others. And finally, many feel alienated from both synagogue life and psychedelic spaces. And they're asking, can I have both? Can I be whole? So when I read Michael's article, I felt gratitude, but also the ache, because it captured some of the spiritual urgency of our moment, some of the ethical concerns of not just the study, but the entire movement, the entire moment, but not yet the communal movement that's already rising, even before I started opening my big mouth. This isn't theoretical, it's happening. People are building this new temple of mirrors now, out of deep memory, experiential prayer, Shabbos tables, psilocybin journeys, heartbreak, and hope. And they're not asking their Jewish leaders to bless it from a distance. They want to be part of the fabric of Jewish life as leaders themselves. That's why I'm here on this panel, not just as one of the religious professionals in the study, not just as a Jew who had a couple powerful trips, but as someone trying to help build that vessel that can hold all of this, the awe and the grief, the insight and the aftermath, the ancient and the emergent. Because what's happening isn't just about psychedelics. It's about the revival of spiritual courage in a time of collapse. And we need each other, writers, scientists, mystics, skeptics, academics, organizers, psychopharmacologists, indigenous elders, harm reductionists, ethicists, chaplains, and, yes, rabbis, if we're going to meet this moment with the depth and responsibility it asks from us. Thank you.
First, I'd like to thank Sam for inviting me to participate in this amazing panel, and also the GTU for hosting this conversation. I'm a medical and psychological anthropologist. I'm currently conducting ethnographic research on psychedelics and spirituality. So for those of you who don't know, ethnography means a lot of deep hanging out, like spending a long period of time with people in their everyday lives for sometimes, I'm actually wrapping up a year of research right now doing that. I'm also doing interviews. So specifically though, I'm interested in the incorporation of mystical experience into the lives of secular Americans and their therapeutic practices via the mainstreaming of psychedelics. I want to understand why secular Americans have turned to psychedelics as tools to transform themselves and cultivate relationships with the divine, as well as how the clinical use of entheogenic substances might transform the secular field of psychiatry. My project involves in-depth ethnographic fieldwork in multiple sites, including a psychedelic-assisted therapy training program, which I also went through myself as part of the research, in psychedelic science conferences, a clinical trial on the use of psilocybin to treat demoralization at the end of life, and in psychedelic churches, where a largely secular public seek to find community and also heal trauma through the use of entheogenic substances. My research team is interdisciplinary, and along with my brilliant co-PI, Dr. Brian Anderson, who's a psychiatrist and psychedelic researcher, our group brings together scholars and practitioners in anthropology, clinical psychology, philosophy, religious studies, including Sam, who's part of our group, and theology. So that's a bit about me. So I've been interested in the religious leader study for some time, and over the course of my fieldwork, I've had the chance to hear a number of the study participants speak in various conferences devoted to the topic of psychedelics and spirituality. So the first thing I'd like to note is that the study not only generated data, but has also influenced a kind of spiritual turn in the field of psychedelic science. The mixing of science and religion has made some people in the field uncomfortable. At You can see with prior claims that Roland Griffiths was a, quote, psychedelic evangelist. There was a New York Times article on that, as well as charges that came out during the FDA expert panel claiming that the MAPS MDMA therapy model of the inner healing intelligence was a form of spiritual therapy, and that Rick Doblin fashioned himself as a messianic therapy cult leader seeking to, quote, spiritualize humanity. These kinds of anxieties about the presence of the spiritual in domains designated as scientific speak to, I think, the complex task of secularizing substances that reliably bring about mystical experiences, many of which have long been understood by various indigenous groups not only as religious sacraments, but as agentive entities that contain a spirit in and of themselves. So secondly, once I read the published study, I was struck by the framing and implications of the research. This is a study that sought to explore how psilocybin not only changes psychological functioning, but also spirituality. A notable finding included the fact that a number of the participants were burning out and were considering leaving their religious vocation, which was mentioned by Michael Pollan, also in his excellent article, but that after participating in the trial, they felt their faith was renewed. And so while some might not think this is a surprising finding, I think it's significant because what we're seeing is a kind of reframing of spirituality as a clinical problem to be treated therapeutically. The formal title of the religious leaders study, at least according to the Johns Hopkins IRB, which was mentioned in the published article, the title was Effects of Psilocybin Facilitated Experience on the Psychology and Effectiveness of Professional Leaders in Religion. So it's clear that the idea of using a psychedelic substance to treat and improve the effectiveness of religious leaders was a central aim. So as an anthropologist, my primary questions are, why has religious experience and its absence become a problem to be corrected and treated therapeutically? And what does this study reveal about the concerns, anxieties, and yearnings of our contemporary social and political moment? So I'll just stop there.
Thank you, everybody. I am Bia Labate. It's a pleasure to be here. I salute the traditional people of this land. And Sam, you forgot to say that I am a visiting scholar at the GTU, a title that you kindly gave me. So thank you for that invitation and for being here. I had a chance to create a little experiment inside Chacruna in our nonprofit. And we read this paper together with our friend, Dr. Osiris Garcia, who's a Mazatec, and my friend, Dr. Jamie Beachy, and our research director, Henrique Antunes, to try to bring a perspective from our team. So I want to quote them as part of this reflection. First, I'm just going to say some facts that I appreciate about the study. I think it's an interesting study, especially like the fact that they picked people that had no previous experiences. So this kind of added flavor to this experiment. I also appreciate the fact that they did try to get more diversity, considering the original study only had Christian representation. They did try, even if not in ideal proportions perhaps, but Judaism, Islam, and Buddhism, which we know is not easy to find. I also appreciate the attempts of mainstream biomedical researchers to talk to other audiences and consider the topic of religious uses of psychedelics and try at least to build some bridges with other forms of knowledge. And I appreciate the fact that the study shows that there is mysticism inside mainstream religions, which is also some notable finding. And remark, as Michael said in his article and Sam in his opening, that this study got a lot of attention and even a lot of controversy. So just for the sake of anthropological tradition, I'm going to do something different and not talk exactly about the study, but what does this study say about us? In sum, is this study really about clergy's experiences, or what does it reveal about our own relationships to psychedelic, to science, to religion? So to me, the most interesting question about this study is not the study itself, but the question surrounding the study. I don't need to get into the whole controversy of, around the paper. I do want to congratulate you for bringing it up, because I do think that it involves some level of courage and acknowledgement to talk about these delicate conversations, and doing it gracefully is always a challenge. and doing it online in the form of hate or inflammatory attacks and personal ad hominem attacks is a very easy way that some people unfortunately take. So I think that's a poor way, but we still have to have hard conversations about complicated topics. So I'm just going to drop my 2 cents. What does the controversy reveal? What does it make us think? Well, one thing is that there is a deeply hybrid relationship in the field of psychedelics between funding, research, activism, and underground psychedelic community. Some of the people doing the clinical trials are part of the underground. The funders are therapists. They sit together. They are also research activists. There's also a lot of political interest in the science. So it's a fact. There's lots of dual relationships and lots of conflicts of interest. And of course, this is comprehensible in a field that didn't start with big endowments or funding from government or institutions. It started in this parallel, para-academic venue, and that's how this research has been advanced so far. So this controversy reveals the nature of the field itself, and I think it's a welcome controversy, minus the hate and the conspiracy theory, which comes together with, unfortunately, at times. So I think there is certainly a story of the psychedelic science that needs to be written, exploring these continuities and discontinuities between clinical research, psychedelic underground, and indigenous shamanism. I mean, to me as an anthropologist, it's a little bit funny, this whole shock around spirit and mysticism. I'm like, which world do you guys live in? Because where I come from, that's kind of normal. I think this story needs to be written. And also I ask, that's the ED, I know you're also AD, always worried about funding. Why does this get so much funding? Why are the funders so interested in it? And why are mainstream articles and publications willing to talk so much about this and to donate to this kind of thing? And I think you can have 2 kinds of explanations. So one explanation would be that back in the day, the powers to be decided to bet into the medicalization horse, so to speak. Lovers of psychedelics wanted to advance this field and said, let's donate to medical science, and that's going to show everybody that these things are not really bad, they're actually good, and you show moms, you show children, and that's going to help the cause. And other people felt that maybe trying to invest in religious leaders would be another good way to mainstream psychedelics, because if mainstream religions liked and accept psychedelics, they would influence Thanksgiving conversations all across America, and people would be more sympathetic. So in this line of thinking, investing in the medical realm would be a way to help change stigma, fear, demonization, persecution, and advance legalization efforts. And then there's another route of explanation that has been said here. Also, Michael wrote in his article, and different people said different things. Would there be an elite of psychedelic funders, researchers, and activists that are interested in actually revigorating religions and using psychedelics as a strategy to shake it up, to try to revitalize mainstream religions that have a lot of problems and issues and people are unhappy about it? Is this a route that people believed in? Because it's this idea, if everybody has a spiritual direct experience, there would be an awakening, and this would be back to communities or not. I don't know, if that was the case. I think those are good questions to ask. Why is this study so appealing? I'm going to say a few of the critical reflections on the study. I think obviously it's a selection bias. People like clergy that would be very prejudiced and against psychedelics would probably not sign up. So, that's kind of obvious, but it needs to be said. Also, I'm going to say other things that maybe to this audience are kind of obvious, but I'm playing this role. I don't know exactly what people know here. The mystical experience scale that was used in the study and also in Johns Hopkins clinical trials is problematic and has been criticized for many people for what? It has a very Western monotheistic bias. It's based on a Vedanta Eastern philosophy. It departs from a certain Paralianist well, you get it.
Perennialist.
Hashtag English second language worldview, the problematic view that all religions have the same common core, and that this core is mystical experience, which has been debunked by religions of scholars. In sum, this scale is what we call ethnocentric. Particular worldviews are taken as universals. Also, the scale has a bias towards positive experiences because there's nothing in the scale that measure negative experiences. And everybody that took psychedelics know they exist. And, it reproduces really binaries, divisions like sacred and profane, etc., etc. The focus on how strongly they believe their sacred experiences revealed a truth was totally real. Not just something imagined or illusory, also reveal Western naturalized reproduction of other Western binaries, such as real, unreal, essence, appearance, authenticity, falseness. So, in sum, I'm an anthropologist, and I'm asking, where are the indigenous perspectives? Where is the, inclusion of polytheistic religions? This kind of approach has a overemphasis on beliefs, on mind, on psychology, on cognition, and lack of incorporation of the dimensions of the body, of the senses. Psychedelics have to do with embodied forms of knowledge. It's not just what you think, it's the discipline of the body, how you feel it in your body. And some researchers have talked about the need to queer the mystical experience, for example. It's kind of white, straight, hetero perspective, and queer spirituality, like psychedelic spirituality, can be embodied, relational, political, visionary. And then the other main problem, and all my respects to all forms of knowledge, but it's this hegemony of science and biomedicine, this constant, I think the three buckets are a little bit bigger than just what you said, unless you put like the whole field of social sciences in the bucket of the mystical experience. But there seems to be an overemphasis always on biomedical research. Anthropology, social sciences, and other kinds of methods have said for millions of ages similar things. They are entirely disregarded. There's no references to any of that. So, bottom line, why don't they create like an interdisciplinary research group, and why don't they ask indigenous people, like they could ask a Mesotech, hey, what do you think of this scale? What should we do? So, I'm not that person that wants to tear down things. These are solutions for us to create a new version for the future. So this brings us, and I promise I'm going to end. I was trying to keep my 5 minutes. I'm almost there. Why must science verify what indigenous people have always known and practiced for generations, that these substances have therapeutic and mystical dimensions? What kind of epistemological hierarchies are reinforced when indigenous knowledge is only considered credible once it has been filtered to Western scientific protocols? For over half a century, the therapeutic potential of plant medicines has been acknowledged by anthropology, yet academic institutions largely ignored them until recently. Is the insistence of laboratory validation, while sidelining indigenous epistemologists, not of a form of epistemic injustice, or even a subtle kind of coloniality masked as scientific rigor? And then about this allegation that researchers are psychedelic evangelists with some kind of secret agenda and want to use science to advance their views, therefore all the studies do not have any potential objective findings and all this controversy. I want to say there is no thing as such a neutral science. All knowledge is situated, shaped by cultural, historical, and political context. Science itself is not a timeless or universal truth machine. It is a social construct built upon particular epistemologies that often reflect Western materialistic and individualistic worldviews. The obsession with scientific objectivity, with stripping away context, emotion, relationship, and meaning, reveals a specific epistemological project to sanitize, to purify, and to isolate variables in the pursuit of clean data. This desire to distill the active ingredient, and here I'm talking about clinical trials in general and not about the study in particular, the desire to distill the active ingredient of a psychedelic substance into a measurable, quantifiable metabolic reaction is not just a research method. It's an ideological stance. It assumes that truth lives in molecules, not in relationships, that healing is a biomedical event, not a spiritual or communal one. But this framework struggles to accommodate indigenous healing systems where illness and wellness are embedded in a relational web between humans, ancestors, spirits, plants, rivers, and landscapes. In these systems, therapeutic efficacy is not simply about pharmacological effects, but about realignment, relational realignment with the self, with the community, with the non-human world. When science insists on framing psychedelics purely through a materialist lens, it is not only limits our understanding, it also erases and delegitimizes other ways of knowing and healing. This is not merely an epistemological preference. It is a form of epistemic violence and ontological flattening. Ironically, it is this very friction between these worldviews, the sacred and the clinical, the relational and the reductionist, that makes this field so intellectually and ethically vital. The point is not to reject science, but to decenter its monopoly on truth and to imagine pluralistic approaches to healing that honor both the molecule and the mystery.
Thank you. Many thanks to Sam and Chris and Jen and everyone at the GTU for creating this gathering today. Thanks to all of you for being a part of it. I'm very delighted to be invited to be on this panel. And my perspective is one of someone who has a neuroscience background and is conducting psychedelic studies with human subjects. And so I'm presenting the hegemonic Western science perspective.
You're the diversity on the panel.
You're a white token. Okay, it's okay.
So, the top line results of this study, I think, for some people are very obvious, and for some people are just jaw-dropping. So, just to summarize a couple of the results that Sam mentioned, just about every study participant found at least one of their psilocybin experiences to be among the top 5 spiritually significant experiences of their lives, and 42% the most profound experience. So for people who've read the literature and people in various psychedelic communities, this is extremely obvious, but the idea that in this case a purified chemical, and just tens of milligrams of a purified chemical, can occasion these kinds of experiences so reliably is just fascinating and amazing and potentially extremely important for our societies worldwide. There also were reports, measures of reports of the participants about positive mood changes and attitudes about life, and also negative mood changes and negative attitudes about life, and also very strong and consistent effects there as well. So not strictly speaking in a religious context, just people reporting about how this changed their everyday life, these participating in this study. And then 16 months afterwards, 71% of the participants reported positive effects on their religious practice and in their appreciation of religious traditions other than their own. And so, not reflecting on this as an expert, but just as a person on planet Earth, like, don't we all need more of that? And isn't it incredible that there is this technique, this procedure that people can go through that has these types of enduring effects that are so pro-social and positive? A lot could be said about the study design, and Bia very eloquently described a lot of the issues about selection bias and about representation and generalizability of the studies. Those are all very significant issues, I would say. But what's unusual about this study compared to other scientific studies are these non-compliance issues. And so I'd like to just talk about those and how we should regard those in the context of the study. So the non-compliance issues were found by the Johns Hopkins Institutional Review Board, the IRB, and so most universities have an IRB that regulates human subjects research. They're tasked with enforcing and monitoring compliance with the federal regulations that govern human subjects research. And this came out of a horrific tradition of human subjects research that was done in a way that was extremely harmful to certain participants. And so there was an understanding that there needed to be a regulatory framework to protect human subjects from mistreatment. And that includes very overt mistreatment and harm directly by participating in the experiment, but also things like protecting subjects' confidentiality and verifying that the research environment in which the studies are taking place is regulated. So vetting of the different study team members, for example, their qualifications. And so those latter areas are the areas of non-compliance. So the study team failed to disclose some of the study team members, some of whom were donors, and failed to disclose to the university, to the IRB, the source of funding, and also failed to disclose conflicts of interest among study team members. And so these are not ambiguous from the perspective of human subjects researchers. These kinds of violations should never happen. This kind of oversight is really unacceptable, and at best, it's a distraction from the research and scientific aims of the study. And at worst, participants in the study were interacting in altered states of consciousness and in the months afterwards, potentially interacting with study team members who were not qualified and certainly had not been vetted by the IRB. So these are very problematic. The IRB could have blocked publication of the research if they found that the results of the study were compromised by these instances of noncompliance. They decided not to do that. Evidently, they have decided to do that for the qualitative research reports. And so the IRB's deliberations are generally not made public. And so in general, we don't know exactly what the IRB decided and what the criteria they used. But for these studies that were reported in this paper, it was found that the noncompliance was consistent with the IRB's desire to see to not prevent these research findings from being disseminated and published. And I think there were also no sanctions from the university against the research team for this. So do the violations affect the interpretation of the data and the results? To my mind, the results are so strong, the effect sizes are so large and so consistent, I can't see how failing to disclose members of the study team and conflicts of interest and so forth really affect the nature of the results and their interpretations. And I'd also say, just in terms of providing some context, the standard in the field, for better or for worse, for conflicts of interest is to disclose them. And it's acknowledged that people have conflicts of interest. Even the most obvious ones that are easy to kind of record and be explicit are the financial conflicts of interest, and there were some in this study. But that's not considered broadly as an impossible barrier for doing the research. The conflicts of interest exist, and they just need to be disclosed. That was not done in this study. But I think in a broader sense, conflicts of interest are rampant, and scientists are doing the work that they're doing because of a passion and because they want to have impact in the world. And they would love to see some results more than others. And us scientists are not necessarily funders of our work, but we're fundraisers for our work. And we need to be cheerleaders, and we need to convince donors and government agencies and foundations about the importance and impact and significance of our work. And so in that sense, we have a very vested emotional interest in certain kinds of outcomes. And those are harder to disclose and to make explicit. But I would argue part of what's distinctive about scientific research, as opposed to other ways of knowing in the world, is a very intentional, comprehensive system to try to eliminate or to minimize the effects of cognitive biases and expectations on the measurements that we make and on the interpretations of them. And so we have all this edifice of what we broadly refer to as a scientific method. This is studies with appropriate control conditions. This is blinding of participants and the experimenters. This is statistical testing with clear assumptions about what a statistical test is, when it's valid to use a statistical test and what the conclusions can be drawn from it. Pre-specification of studies, so describing what the study is in advance and putting it in a public place, and then committing to doing the study in a certain way with a certain kind of analysis. All of these things are, I would argue, very powerful ways of making measurements and conclusions that are less likely to be influenced by the desires and the cognitive biases of the individual scientists. And all of the things I mentioned, some of them are done very well in the study, some of them not done at all. And so we can have a further discussion about that. But I think the focus of the conflict of interest story about just the conflict of interest around funding is missing a large part of it that's not frequently discussed. And so there are conflicts of interest, and many of us in the world of psychedelics research are in it because of some powerful experience that we've had, or that someone that we know has had, or that we are strongly motivated to reduce suffering in the world due to mental health disorders. And so we're not coming at it from a neutral place, and not all results are equally exciting for us. So that's where I would draw a distinction between science and other types of investigation and other types of just knowing about the world, is to be able to identify, acknowledge these biases, and then limit their impact on the study. Next.
Thank you to each of you. I wish we had more time, but let's just launch into a couple of questions here. I'll start, and I'm also really interested in if any questions emerged among the panelists themselves, but I'll throw one out there. One of the things that's striking about this study is the decade that elapsed from when the research began, and the almost decade even from when the research was conducted until the publication. And Michael Pollan, I'm curious as somebody who really, your writing on psychedelics specifically spanned that decade. And you have been talking about psychedelics and spirituality and mysticism from your first writings on this topic. It figured centrally in your 2018 book, and now you have this article that you just completed that I'm sure you had drafts of maybe even years ago because of the stalling of the publication. I'm curious from your perspective, what has changed in this landscape? What did it feel like to be writing in this vein in 2025 versus in 2015?
It's a good question. I finished the article more than a year ago. I think I reported it and wrote it in the spring of 2023, this IRB investigation. So the New Yorker did not want to publish until the scientific article came out. That they felt that legitimized the whole thing, peer-reviewed science and so on. I argued that it really was not relevant to the article. I was describing certain people's experience. It was about narrative, but the New Yorker's the New Yorker. The 10 years, just to answer that question quickly, a lot of it was a real sincere effort on the part of the researchers to recruit greater diversity. And they had a lot of trouble. Now, it may be that they didn't have the proper connections, but for example, they spent years trying to find a Hindu who would participate. I don't know that they actively looked for indigenous religious leaders. I think that would have been, I totally agree, would have been very interesting. But they kept the study open for that reason. And then there were the investigations that came after. In terms of the landscape of psychedelics, it's, as you would expect, gotten a lot more gnarly. In 2018, when I was writing about it, I was struck by the fact that there were hardly any critics. In fact, the first piece I wrote for the New Yorker was a very enthusiastic piece about the treatment. It was called the TRIP treatment. It was about treating people with cancer, often terminal diagnoses, whose lives have been transformed, their fear of death eliminated. And it was so positive that the editor of the New Yorker asked me specifically to go find somebody who thinks this is all bullshit to put on page 1. This is how editors think. They're protecting themselves. And my first call was to Tom Insel, who at the time was the director of the National Institute of Mental Health. Surely someone of that establishment stature would give me a negative quote about psychedelic research. He's in Davos, and I get him on the phone, and I ask him the question, and he says, "No, I think this research is really important. It needs to go forward." And he's like, "Oh shit." Yeah, I should have called Bia. That's true. That was, yeah. So, at that moment, if I haven't reread the book, but it's a fairly positive treatment of the subject that doesn't really look at some of the negative impacts that we've seen, the fact that there is risk involved and people get into trouble using psychedelics, and I would have paid much more attention to that. critics have emerged, and they're calling attention to abuse by therapists, which is a real phenomenon. They're calling attention to bias in research, which is, as Michael indicated, is a real phenomenon. All of that is very healthy, but it's a much more complicated beat than it was. And you also have these disenchanted psychonauts, people who were deeply involved with psychedelics, who had some kind of conversion to deciding they are the root of all evil, and they are these gadflies are coming after researchers and journalists, and in fact one of them played a role in the investigations that surrounded this study. So there's a healthy debate. I don't think the proper approach, though, in that case is to try to suppress publication. I think the proper approach should be to allow publication and then fight it out and argue it. So it's a very complicated landscape for a journalist, and one of the things, in fact, we're doing at the BCSP is doing a lot of journalism around psychedelics, the idea being funding journalism, the idea being to develop a cadre of really good, sophisticated journalists who can write about all these complexities with more nuance and sophistication.
Thank you. Anyone from the panel have a question? Or should I just go launch into another?
I just want to applaud Michael's words. I want to make a little video of a hardcore scientist talking about their investment on this research, because I find it really refreshing that he's just speaking the truth, but it's not said often by scientists in public, and clearly, that there is an effort, that this is a construct. And so this gets stirred in the publication. It exists as conversations in the hallway, but hardly ever on the papers or when the results are shared. So I thought it was really interesting to hear that from you. Thank you.
I'd like to explore a little bit more this question of expectancy bias, or the power of suggestion. I think psychedelic studies brings together these interdisciplinary conversations, or at least it should. And I think this is a really interesting terrain where, from a sort of scientific methods perspective, at all costs you want to avoid expectancy bias and the power of suggestion. From a religious studies perspective, it's like, well, yeah, and that's not only inevitable and expected, but it's actually some of the most powerful and profound dimensions of what we're talking about here. And as Bia mentioned, right, that of course there's no culturally neutral space that could be possible. It's striking the ways that different sets and settings fundamentally transform the experiences with these substances. And if I could quote my friend Aidan here from a 2022 article that she co-authored, just noting that the myopic focus on the psychedelic substance itself in some media reporting gives the impression that sessions consist of little else beyond the administering of psychedelics and the crafting of a supportive set and setting. Yet a range of therapeutic modalities and frameworks are almost always present. In the scientific literature on psychedelic medicine, these frameworks are typically relegated to footnotes and passing mentions. And I think that applies in this study as well to some degree. There was clearly an elaborate preparation and integration process that is sometimes sidestepped because of this fear of sort of outing yourself as somehow imprinting the experience. And so even in this article, in the end, when they're sort of envisioning like possible improvements for future research, it's saying, we did improve upon the Good Friday experiment of 1962. And the way we did that, they said, is because we conducted these psilocybin sessions individually to maximize the independence of each participant's data and, quote, in a controlled living room-like setting rather than in a chapel during a religious service. But we could maybe go even further, they say, in eliminating all references to, quote, sacred experiences in recruitment, in preparation. And I don't know who I want to direct this question to. Zac as a participant, Michael Silver as a scientist, Bia and Aidan as people who've weighed in on this, Michael as someone who's documented it. But I'm just struck by the scientific project to, as much as possible, extricate anything that smacks of religion, as if that would then lead this into a more objective, transparent process, when in fact, that so-called objective, transparent process is itself historically, culturally situated. I'm just curious if anyone wants to weigh in on this, this conflict.
Well, I would say, thank you for the question, imagining stripping away all of those elements, either in the materials for actually announcing or proposing the study to sign people up. I don't know if I would have signed up if I had seen that this was for the purpose of a religious professional. It didn't say you will have a sacred experience. They wanted to know something about my experience, my Jewish experience in the context of this research. I mean, I could have been okay with the removal of mushroom basalt statues, right? These little tiny walking mushrooms. Any of the paraphernalia. I mean, it looked like an anthropology professor's living room. That's not what they look like anymore. Or beautiful art books. So it was incredibly comfortable, but it was cozy. There were some elements that I found to be quite quaint and also dated. And so I could imagine that that gap that you mentioned, even just in the research or the footnotes, until now, I know that there are better ways. There are more refined approaches that don't mean to have everything be completely white and plastic and neutral, but in a way that doesn't have some of the relics of the 60s and the 70s that don't work for it, and they're not culturally relevant anymore.
There's also the question of the music, which Zac talked to me about, that had I think they were very unaware of this, but had a strong kind of Christian bias.
Sure. Well, a Christian bias, I would say it was potentially just what the researcher liked. That there was Christian music, Hindu music, but there was Enya also. There was George Harrison. And so I would say that there was also an alternative Johns Hopkins playlist that was put together by Matt Johnson that was much more lo-fi beats, right? Not suggestive of any kind of experience, but just kind of like wavy, maybe spa music. I don't know if I would have had such a powerful reaction inside myself if I wasn't listening to Mysterium or O Alleluia or even Vivaldi. And so what I've come to understand is, of course, like the meaning and the nature of intervention, and how, at least in my context now that I've created my own context, how to be really careful about the energies and the influences that are going into these things, because it could have an effect. What kind of effect do we want to have?
Actually, yeah, I have a kind of a counterpoint or a counterexample through a story. So part of my research, I've been interviewing members of psychedelic churches, and somebody that I interviewed told me a story about, I always ask about their religious background. He told me a story about how he was raised in what he called a spiritual desert by basically hardcore atheists. And he was also diagnosed with and suffered from treatment-resistant depression that he had his whole life. He started doing ketamine infusions in a clinical setting, and on the fourth or fifth one, he said he had a complete spiritual awakening. He became a river and no longer identified with his diagnosis, and after that, he changed his life and actually started to pursue a kind of a spiritual path. What I find really interesting is that this was an example of a psychedelically induced spiritual experience that had no priming or preparation included. It was in a clinical setting. And so I think, something I'm now looking into is with the increasing accessibility of ketamine clinics across the US, we may be actually seeing this kind of unbidden spiritual experience in sterile clinical settings. And it could be happening far more than we're actually aware. And this is from an ethnographic study. It's not a clinical trial, but I find it really interesting because it's actually an example of something that's unprimed, seemingly, and it would be the opposite, and that people are still having that. So that's a story I keep coming back to try to understand.
Thank you. Maybe I could just add that the impetus for scientific studies to essentially eliminate what broadly are referred to as set and setting, or is part of it is just a desire to control the experimental factors that you can control for interpretability of results and to, again, remove these biases. But a lot of it comes from the fact that you cannot do research in the US on psychedelics without FDA approval. And they have a clinical trial mindset that's based on testing drugs for safety and efficacy. And so the placebo control is considered the only way to do it properly. And placebo effects are powerful and real and have a biological basis. And so I think they're a fascinating area of research. And from this kind of scientific viewpoint, the interactions between set and setting and whatever the pharmacological action of the drug is incredibly exciting, and for understanding the mind and brain and consciousness, for understanding better treatments for a variety of psychiatric disorders. And so psychedelics really sort of insist, but there's no way for us to just discount what we broadly are calling placebo effects. They are powerful and they interact with the biochemical action of the drug in meaningful ways.
Thank you. I am mindful of time, and we are over time, and I know we've got parents and a lot of hot people in this room. Thank you so much to our panelists, and thank you to everyone coming.